Bon matin à tous, en cette belle journée montréalaise avec, comme Catherine a mentionné, belle pluie torrentielle. Good morning, good evening, President Jin. Pleasure to see you again, and thank you for participating this evening in Beijing to this discussion. I first met President Jin a long time ago. He probably doesn't remember, but he was then Executive Vice President of the Asian Development Bank when I used to be based out of Asia. He was then considered one of the superstars coming out of the finance ministry of China in the 90s, early 2000s, having studied abroad, worked at the World Bank, Asian Development Bank after this, and then became the vice chairman of the China Investment Corporation, which was a very important sovereign wealth fund, especially played a key role during the financial crisis of the 2008-2009. One of the items that came out of 2009 was also the Chinese government proposing to put in place an infrastructure bank to try to accelerate infrastructure development in Asia, with some frustrations on the part of a number of countries over there of the slowness and the bureaucracy that was for investing in infrastructure in Asia, which was in great needs at the time and still now. President Jin became the president of Asian Infrastructure Bank, the first one, in December 2015 when it was launched. And one of the attempts, and since then they have deployed over $35 billion of capital across 35 countries, I believe, in about 180 different projects. But one of the items that struck me then, as I was seeing the development of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, was a comment that President Jin did at the time. And the comment was that he wanted to create a bank that was going to be lean, clean, and green. And as such, as an organization, it was very, very different, especially when talk about lean, about having effective deployment and rapid deployment in an environment, Asia, that was had enormous amount of challenges from an environmental standpoint. And this is where the Infrastructure Bank became important. So the first question that I'd like you, President Jin, to start discussing is when you think about that comment that you made at the time about being lean, clean, and green, 6 years on, how would you judge, how would you assess the good and the bad of the projects and the development of the bank in Asia at this point in time?
Bonjour, je suis très content de participer à cette conférence de Montréal. I miss Montreal. And thank you very much for this opportunity. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for me to share some information with our Canadian friends. I'd like to thank the Canadian government, the people, for supporting this bank. Canada is one of the first countries I talked to, and I'm very pleased. 8 months after the bank was up and running, Canada became a full member. Now, you asked a very important question, and you referred to the basic principles of the bank being lean, clean, and green. As you know, the bank was conceptualized in the years when there was debate about the functions of the multilateral institutions. So we in China started to work with the ASEAN countries and Middle Eastern countries, Central Asian countries, thinking about how we can conceptualize a new development bank. At that time, there were questions as to the need for creating a new bank when the World Bank, as the flagship development institution, was there and supported by the frigates, such as some of the regional development banks. Was there any need for creating a new multilateral development institution? Should we put the resources in existing institutions to save costs? What is the raison d'etre of creating a new one? Those questions were repeatedly raised during the time when we started to inviting countries to join. And finally, in January 16th, 57 founding members created this bank. Now we have grown to be 105. I'm very proud to say that we have the core values of this bank being lean. Why lean? Because we think in the 21st century, we must have an institution which is very, very cost effective. Because the old multilateral institutions got their capital from the taxpayers' money. And over the last 7 decades, it's so frequent that the management of the development banks would have to knock on the doors of the shareholders asking for general capital to be increased again and again and again. Could we have a new institution which can depend on its own initiative, depend on its own capacity to expand its capital base and provide support to its clients? So being lean is very important. I think the bank should be free of institutional obesity. We should not have redundancy. And that is why, in terms of the structure, we have the 2 operational vice presidencies, which covers, one covers some of the region, and the rest of the regions were covered by another vice president. And we would like to have our operational staff to be amphibians, which means they should be good at both the public sector and the private sector. They must be able to process projects with sovereign-backed financing, and also they should also do their job in working with the private sector. That is being lean. And we have been very, very careful not to create a bureaucracy, so much so that in the future years, you will find it very hard to lay off the staff. You find the cost is too high. The second is clean. I think it's very important, particularly for a developing country such as China, to start to build a multilateral development institution. Being clean is crucial. It's not simply a reputational issue. It is also very important for the management and the staff to be committed to developing infrastructure projects with the limited resources put in and get the maximum output. All too often, we see so many infrastructure projects with long gestation period have their money siphoned off to some other uses. So this is something very, very important. We have very high bar. The bank must be clean and squeaky clean. We have zero tolerance for corruption, cheating, fraud, misappropriation of the resources, and embezzlement of public funds are absolutely forbidden. But to achieve this, it's very much important for the senior management members to lead by example. There's a French saying, le poisson pourrit par la tête. So if the senior management is not clean, as we say, the fish gets rotten at the head. How can you ask the rank and file to keep clean? So this zero tolerance of corruption applies to the procurement of projects we finance, and also applies to the corporate procurement in dealing with any cases of corruption. So far, we have never ever had any problems in our management team, in our staff, and we monitor very closely the implementation of the projects. Finally, being green. You see, the bank was created a couple months after the Paris Agreement was entered into by so many signatory countries. And climate change mitigation adaptation was deeply embedded in our Articles of Agreement. But at that time, we talked about environmental protection. And as you see, we set a very high target of financing the private climate change mitigation and adaptation projects. By 2025, no less than 50% of our financing will go to the climate projects. At this stage, we already achieved 48%. So being lean, clean, and green is important for a development bank created in the 21st century. Let me stop here.
Thank you, President Jin. Speaking of being lean, which has probably been very useful the last 2 years. Last 2 years, we've been through a pretty traumatic experience for most countries around the globe with the pandemic. And I suspect, like a number of organizations, you've had to adapt to this environment. But how have you been able to adapt on your mission in light of the pandemic to try to combine both the mission in climate change mitigation and now in healthcare, especially for countries around Asia?
The world has been hit by the double whammy of the last 2.5 years, and so is this bank. But being lean, I think, helps with our agility and adaptability. That makes us very responsive to the needs of the countries. First, as you see, the pandemic, COVID-19, certainly hit many countries, which made it impossible for many countries to go on with their mainstream business of developing infrastructure. What should we do? We certainly should be responsive to the needs of the countries. But the lean institution is very agile, not just in our concept, but also in our organizational ability. And we can quickly repurpose our resources to help those countries. Some people question the validity of providing support to address COVID-19 instead of supporting infrastructure projects. But if you take a look at the Articles Agreement, it is obviously no problem. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's mandate is to promote broad-based economic and social development through investment in infrastructure and other productive sectors. Now, I put these words, other productive sectors, in the negotiation. I put this into the Articles Agreement. But actually, I learned this from the experience of EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. As you know, the EBRD had a very narrow mandate, helping the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, its republics, Central and Eastern countries to transition towards market economy. 15 years later, mission complete, job done. Should they shut down EBRD or change the mandate? So we learned a lesson from that. We set the mandate very broad, and I put in the idea of other productive sectors. So during the negotiations, some people asked me, some chief negotiators asked me, said, Mr. Jin, why did you put in other productive sectors? What does that mean? And I clarified, other productive sectors means other productive sectors. Now, we find 4 years later, we came against the COVID-19. So we try to shift towards dealing with the COVID-19. Because in my view, healthcare sector is very important, is a productive sector. Only a healthy nation is productive. So some people would say, why do you divert from the mainstream business of infrastructure investment to healthcare support? I think the answer is obvious. Only by helping the countries dealing with the pressures in the healthcare sector and put an end to the spread of the COVID-19, could it be possible for this country to go back to normal and to resume their infrastructure projects? You see, the Articles Agreement gives us the room for maneuver, and the bank is agile enough to deal with this. And as you see, because of the recent development in Ukraine, and the impact of the war in Ukraine certainly was felt across quite a number of countries. What should we do? We should help all these countries. That is why, you see, we've been able to handle the double whammy of climate change and COVID-19 plus the impact of the war in Ukraine.
Good. And credit to you, because doing it out of Beijing with all the restrictions that existed for traveling must have been very, very difficult for the staff of your bank. In the one of the concerns that is often raised with multilateral development banks is, and it would be done by the private sector, is always the concern of the crowding out of capital and the fact that private sector might not be able to participate in the same way. But I think you've been on record and you've made that very clear, and I'd like you to bring us forward and to talk about the future a little bit, especially for the private sector, as to what is the role of the AIIB in being a catalyst to encourage the private sector and to work with private capital and be able to invest and to grow and to participate in the development of Asia in its infrastructure.
We attach great importance to mobilizing resources from the private capital. The corporate strategy approved by the board would like us to do at least 50% of the financing in the private sector by 2030. Now, I think, it's often said that the public sector, the multilateral development banks, should not crowd out the private sector. It's almost a cliche. It's almost a meaningless cliche. And I don't think it is something a lot of people who talk about it don't really understand. And a cliche is something, you talk about without understanding what it really is. How much financial resources combined of the multilateral institutions worldwide, very much limited. It's a drop in the bucket. Compared with the 2 or 3 trillions of dollars equivalent moving along around the globe every day. How could this tiny drop of resources crowd out the private sector? It's not possible. But we often heard about this. You know why? Because in some cases, the private sector a project was done or picked up by MDB, multilateral development banks, whereas the private sector would fight shy of this kind of thing. It's not pleased that the multilateral development banks crowd out the private sector. It's because the private sector doesn't want to do it. In some cases, the multilateral development banks may push out the private investors in a project by pricing them out with aggressively competitive pricing. But you see, the private sector investors look for high returns, and they are picky and choosy. They will not take anything which is not worth their trouble. So even if the public sector institutions like the multilateral development banks do all of the projects they want, this huge amount of projects which have to be handled by the private sector. So our efforts is to work with the private sector. Indeed, we'll be very lucky if the private sector would like to crowd us in. I have talked to many private sector investors. They normally would like to, shy away from you, and because you are so bureaucratic, it takes so long a time for us to complete the process of a project. They have no patience with your bureaucracy. That's the problem. But private sector also needs multilateral development banks in some cases. I think if we do well, we are welcome. Because in some areas, if the private sector have the guts to invest in a country which is considered risky, they may come to us. Hey, because you have access to the local authorities, to central government, if there's any irregularities, if we have some problems, you can help us. We deal with the market risks, but we have difficulty with policy uncertainty. We have difficulty dealing with the whimsical behavior of some of the governments. We need you. So we could be very good partners. Let me share with you some of the experience we have. For instance, not long ago, we financed a project in Vietnam. It's a hydropower project. The Vietnamese government wants to divest itself out of the investment in this hydropower project, which was built in 2014. And then the private sector will step in, and they wanted us to go with them. We happily took the job so that the Vietnamese government could release the investment in this so that they can transfer the resources for some social programs, whereas the private sector and AIIB work together. This is one example. Another very important project is our managed portfolio working with Amundi to have global green bonds, and we mobilize private sector resources for the green bonds to invest in renewables. So all this indicates that, first of all, we should have no illusions we are so important we can crowd out private sector. That's not true. But secondly, we should be willing to work with the private sector and help them to deal with tough situations as and when necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, President Jin. Now we have about 3 minutes, and it's always good to finish with a view looking forward, especially for Asia. So when you look at your agenda over the next 2 years, hopefully we're going to get into some sense of normalcy out of the COVID and the pandemic situation. What is on the agenda of the AIIB going forward for Asian infrastructure and climate change mitigation? What are some of the 2 or 3 key points that you're going to be focusing on that would be useful for the audience here?
First of all, I'd like to make it clear that even during the pandemic period, we have never relaxed our efforts to propel the pipeline for the normal infrastructure projects. We try to explore the possibility of investing in infrastructure in the non-regional members. You see, Asian countries cannot separate themselves from the rest of the world. Asia can only sustain its development by working in close collaboration with Europe, with Gulf countries, and with North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. So we have continued to prepare projects. It's going very strong. And secondly, we just have the board approve the operational hub in UAE. And this hub will help us to develop a closer partnership with the market, with the client countries in the outside Asia. So we are working on 2 legs. One is to continue to develop infrastructure projects in Asia and also to improve the connectivity with the rest of the world with the resources available to us. So we are very much confident. Let me take this opportunity to thank our audience in Canada. And I'm looking forward to visiting your country again. Thank you.
Thank you, President Jin. And we're looking forward to see you again in Montreal sooner than later. Always a pleasure to discuss with you.
Thank you. I would welcome you to be in our headquarters in Beijing.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.